Good morning. This is Mr. Mike for the Mechanicsburg Learning Center with Mr. Mike's Dino-A-Day episode number 42. 42 straight days talking about dinosaurs, a different one every single day. Today, I'd like to talk to you about an animal that was pretty startling when it was first discovered. First, let me tell you a little bit about an animal that we have not talked about yet, but we will eventually get around to it. It's called Oviraptor. Now this is a model of Oviraptor. You can see by its skull it had a nice crest. The name Oviraptor means egg thief, and we've figured out that it could have gone after eggs, but it got an unfair name because it really was discovered on top of eggs. It turned out to be its own eggs. It wasn't attacking other dinosaur eggs. That's not to say it never attacked eggs, but the name was not quite as accurate as we had hoped. So this is Oviraptor, and the reason I wanted to bring him up is compared to, let's say, a 5'10" or 6' human, it would come up to maybe just about our knees. Well, the animal we're going to talk about today looks like Oviraptor. It is an Oviraptorid, but its name is kind of messed up. Now, the thing also you'll notice about the Oviraptor is the crest on its head. The animal we're going to talk about today doesn't necessarily have a crest, but it is really big. And the animal in question is Gigantoraptor. Let's take a look at the size of Gigantoraptor so you can get a sense of how big this thing was. Now, think about this. The raptors in Jurassic Park movies were oversized. They were actually based on Deinonychus, which we talked about in the previous episode. So they were larger than they actually were in real life in terms of velociraptors. But if you would put a velociraptor up beside this big boy, Gigantoraptor, it would come up to about here. So this is a gigantic animal comparatively so to Velociraptor. But now, here's where the name gets a little messed up. It's not actually classified as a raptor. It's classified as a theropod or an oviraptorid. So it's more related to the oviraptor we just talked about, and a theropod is a velociraptor and a T-Rex. So it's a little confusing because it's not a true raptor, yet it has some relations to both those different kinds of species. So you can see that's a typical height of an adult, and you can see that the Gigantoraptor would tower over us. An animal this big, related to the oviraptorids, which definitely had some feathers. A lot of speculation on whether this thing had feathers or not. Some thought that it may have had proto-feathers, like smaller feathers. If it had full set of fluffy feathers, which it may have had on its claws. But if it was completely covered in feathers, it may have literally baked itself because it would have kept itself too warm and not be able to thermoregulate its body temperature. So, maybe you someday will be the one that will figure out whether Gigantoraptor actually had feathers or not. So, now here, just to put this in perspective, I'll show you a close-up picture of an actual Gigantoraptor skeleton. You can see that. That's real cool. Quite tall. Look closely down here. What is that? That little thing down there is an Oviraptor. So, here's your Oviraptor right there. All right. And this is how big Gigantoraptor is in relation. Sorry about the lighting here. I'll see if I can get this right for you. Wow, having a lot of trouble today. Okay, see that? So anyway, Gigantoraptor, a gigantic animal. Not as big as, let's say, the Tyrannosaurs, but it would have come close. It would have probably been able to stand eye to eye with a T-Rex. And of course, it wouldn't come near the Titanosaurs or the sauropods. But nonetheless, it was a very big animal, especially considering that it's related to the Oviraptor. So this thing was discovered in China in 2005 by a famous, extremely famous Chinese paleontologist who we have discussed before. His name, Xing Zhu. So 2005, he discovered it. 2 years later, he named it. Now, the interesting thing was how this discovery went down. Jingzhu, being a famous paleontologist in China, folks came to him and said, Dr. Zhu, we would like to make a documentary about this very interesting animal that you discovered. That animal was Sonatosaurus. Sonatosaurus is a sauropod. So they came to him and he agreed to reenact the finding of Sonatosaurus. So basically he went to the site where he knew there were some bones located and he began to chip away and unearth the femur, which is what? Thigh bone of this Sonatosaurus. He scrapes it, wipes it down, looks at it after he's unearthed it, and looks at it and says whatever the word for eureka is in Chinese, Haito, and turned out that it was not Sonatosaurus. It turned out to be an animal he had never ever heard of, and science had never seen. And sure enough, a couple years later, he named that animal Gigantoraptor. So the actual excavation and initial discovery of Gigantoraptor is now on film for all the world to see. So Gigantoraptor was huge. It had a beak with no teeth. It stood about 16 feet tall, which is when you saw the size comparison between a human and us, quite an animal. 16 feet tall. As I said, no teeth. So there is a little bit of conjecture on what it ate. We think it probably snapped up plants. It may have been carnivorous. It could have eaten maybe small lizards. It doesn't look like it had the type of mouth to attack large animals, but the beak was certainly sharp, like some of the latter day large birds that went extinct only literally thousands of years ago instead of millions of years ago. Those things were large carnivorous birds. So it could have eaten meat, but it was big. And in fact, it's the largest beaked theropod that we know of until we discover something else. In fact, there was something discovered recently called Bie long, which could in fact be actually a little bit bigger than Gigantoraptor. But right now, as far as the bones and the evidence is telling us that this guy's the big boy. So Jingzhu digs it up and names it, becomes a famous discovery. And the one thing that it made things a little bit more confusing. We talk about the relationship of dinosaurs to birds and the fact that little tiny birds descended from the big old dinosaurs like T-Rex, and not so much big, but Velociraptor. So the big guys actually evolved downward in terms of size. And this kind of throws that on its head and twists it around, because this was a big thing that more than likely did in fact evolve down to birds. So the fact that maybe it had some gigantism and grew very large because of its environment, who knows? And it's really tough to tell by looking at bones. But these are some of the theories. So this thing was discovered in Beijing. It's named Gigantoraptor erlaniensis. Ensis, whenever you hear ensis at the end of the second name of a dinosaur, ensis refers to where it was discovered. So it was found in the Erlian Basin in the Gobi Desert, near Beijing, in China. So the first thing that was unearthed from the animal was a thigh bone, which we could not identify. At least Jingzhu didn't know what it was. He just knew that it wasn't the animal that he expected when he started digging it out. So let's get to the fresh poem recently completed by Mr. Mike, all about Gigantoraptor and the peculiar way that it was discovered. Related to Oviraptor, but a heck of a lot bigger. Gigantoraptor. Let's get this straight right from the start. This beast was not a raptor. Although it has that moniker, it marks another chapter. And yet, Gigantoraptor's name does have one fact within it. This gal was huge, 16 feet tall, which may not be her limit. She's classified as subadult. Her growing wasn't finished, and so her reputation as a hawk is undiminished. She had a beak and had no teeth, but that's not why she's vital. Which theropod was largest with a beak? She holds the title. The way that she was found is rather wild and amusing. Her leg bone was unearthed, and after that it got confusing. A scientist, Jingzhu, was asked to reenact his finding and film a documentary. They wanted it spellbinding. The film was set in China, where Jingzhu was well respected. He knew the place to go where dino bones could be detected. He grabbed his tools. They started filming. As he started working, he chipped away exactly where he knew more bones were lurking. They wanted to spotlight the beast he'd recently discovered. So as they filmed, he scraped away and finally uncovered the thigh bone of Sonatosaurus. That's what they expected. Jingzhu then took a closer look at what he'd just collected. He thought it was the leg bone of a beast he'd seen already. Good thing that as he dug it out, they kept their cameras steady. By now you figured out Gigantoraptor was the creature that owned that fossiled bone and should be one that they should feature. The Gigantoraptor, a fact-packed dino rhyme by Mr. Mike, put together for you by the Mechanicsburg Learning Center and yours truly. So we want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching the videos and sharing them on Facebook. Thank you for subscribing and watching them on Mr. Mike Sgrignoli's YouTube page. We do this live every day on Facebook, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I want to thank you for tuning in. And for the upsized oviraptorid known as Gigantoraptor, this is Mr. Mike saying, let's do it again tomorrow.